There's something
Project
I've
is
never
behind
told
schedule
anyone.
and over budget. I need to know why.
Not because I'm
You've had some money
ashamed.
was working around the clock to
Not
catch up.
exactly. But because some stories you keep. Not out of fear of what people will think, but because putting them into words feels like it would make them smaller, like it would reduce something that was so large, so silent, so completely ours. But today, I want to tell it. To you. Just to you. So come closer. Close whatever you have open. Because what I'm about to share isn't one of those beautiful love stories that ends with someone running through an airport or a declaration in the pouring rain. This is a real love story, and real love, you already know, carries a different kind of weight. I was 26 years old the first time I walked into that office. I remember the smell before anything else. That particular mix of paper and coffee brewed too early and air conditioning that ran too cold in winter and too weak in summer. Donovan and Associates occupied the 17th floor of a glass tower in the heart of Manhattan, and when you stepped off the elevator, the first thing you saw was an all-white reception area with gold letters on the wall and a woman behind a marble desk who looked at you like you needed to prove you belonged there. That woman wasn't Claire. That was me. I was the front desk secretary before I became the CEO's personal assistant. I was promoted after 6 months because, according to the HR manager, I was the only person on that floor who could anticipate what Dr. Donovan needed before she asked. At the time, I thought that was a compliment. Later, I understood it was a warning dressed up as one. Anticipating what Claire Donovan needed wasn't a talent, it was survival. Claire was 38 years old back then, 12 years older than me. Dark brown hair, nearly black, always pinned in a chignon that never came loose, not even at the end of a 14-hour day. Eyes the same deep shade of brown, so dark they looked almost black depending on the light, tall, lean in the way that tense people are lean, with the posture of someone who had never once in her life allowed herself to lean back in a chair. She wasn't cold because she was cruel. It took me a long time to understand that. At first, like everyone else in the office, I thought she was simply made that way. One of those women who had reached where she'd reached by leaving behind anything that might look like weakness, and in the vocabulary of that environment, weakness was anything too human. Smiling at employees was weakness. Saying thank you without it sounding like a concession was weakness. Remembering the name of your secretary's nephew was weakness. Claire did none of those things. She arrived at 7:30 every morning. Her coffee was a double espresso, no sugar, served in a specific cup that was washed and set aside in the kitchenette every morning. She didn't greet anyone. She walked in, extended her hand without looking up. I placed the cup. She moved on. It was a choreography, and for a long time, I was good at that dance because I needed to be. I had come out of a 3-year relationship with a man who was kind, stable, predictable, and completely wrong for me in ways I was still trying to name. We had ended things without fights, without betrayal, without drama. Just that quiet exhaustion of two people who respect each other too much to keep pretending it's enough. He left on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases and a hug that lasted too long to be casual and not long enough to be what we both needed. My family didn't understand, my mother least of all. Traditional family from small-town Tennessee, relocated to Nashville when I was 12. My mother was the kind of woman who kept the Bible on her nightstand and the ideal wedding menu in her head since the day I was born. Daniel was that menu. Polite, Christian, an engineer, from a known family. When I ended things with him, she didn't call me for a week. When she finally did, the first thing she said was, "Maya, you're going to regret this." Maybe she was right. Just not for the reason she thought. Have you ever been in a place in your life where nothing was truly wrong, but nothing felt quite right either? There wasn't enough pain to justify the restlessness. But the restlessness was there anyway, like a small stone in your shoe that you learn to ignore until one day you can't take another step. That was exactly how I felt when I began working closely with Claire, and in the beginning, I promise, it was nothing. It was just work. Schedules, contracts, phone calls, meetings, corporate trips where I carried her briefcase and took notes while she ran entire rooms full of executives like she was steering a car down an empty road. I admired that. Anyone would have admired it, but it took me a very long time to separate the admiration from everything else. The first moment something shifted was so small I almost didn't catch it. It was an afternoon in October. I had come into her office to confirm a rescheduled meeting, and she was standing at the window, her back to me, looking out at the city below. That wasn't unusual. Claire stood like that sometimes, between one meeting and the next, as though she needed 30 seconds of silence to reorganize herself. But that day, when I said her name to get her attention, she paused a full second before turning around. And when she turned, there was something on her face I had never seen before. Not sadness exactly. Exhaustion. The kind that doesn't go away after a good night's sleep. She looked at me, and for 1 second, just one, it seemed like she was about to say something that had nothing to do with work, but then her face closed. The chignon stayed perfect. Her shoulders returned to their usual position. "Confirm the 3 o'clock, she said, "and cancel tomorrow's dinner." I wrote it down. I left. I closed the door behind me, and I stood in the hallway for maybe 5 seconds, clipboard pressed against my chest, not fully understanding what had just happened, but knowing, with something that still had no name, that something had. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're listening from right now. I want to know where this story is reaching, because this story isn't only mine. I know that much. October moved through the city with that golden, melancholy light that New York gets when summer leaves and winter hasn't yet arrived in full. The trees in Central Park turned orange, and I watched them from the office window every morning while I organized Claire's schedule and pretended it was just another day. The office had its own particular culture. Everyone knew Dr. Donovan was demanding. Everyone knew that working directly with her was a mixture of privilege and penance. The partners respected her with the kind of respect that has fear inside it. The interns avoided her entirely. The younger associates did everything they could to impress her, and pretended not to care when she walked down the hallways without glancing in their direction. But I stayed close. That was my job. And staying close, you begin to see things others don't. I saw that she ate lunch alone in her office nearly every day. Not because she had no one to eat with, but because it was the only moment in the day when no one expected anything from her. I saw that she kept a small photograph in the right drawer of her desk, face down, that she never touched in front of anyone but that I once saw between her hands, when she hadn't realized I'd come back for a forgotten document. I saw that she stayed in the office after everyone else had gone, not because she was a workaholic, but because she seemed to have no urgency to get anywhere else. That told me something about her life outside those walls that she never communicated in words. And I, who had arrived at that job still carrying the ghost of a relationship that hadn't hurt enough, and a family that didn't understand my silences, I recognized that kind of isolation. Not identical to mine, but from the same family of loneliness. It was toward the end of October that we first stayed late together in any real sense. It wasn't the wine night. That came later. This was different. A major case fell into crisis. A settlement that had been nearly finalized collapsed on a Thursday afternoon when the opposing party introduced new documentation, and suddenly there was a race against time to rebuild the entire strategy before a hearing scheduled for Monday morning. Claire dismissed everyone at 8 in the evening. She kept only whoever was absolutely essential. And for some reason, I was essential. We stayed until midnight. She dictated. I took notes. She asked. I provided. It was intense the way crises are intense. That electric urgency that makes you forget you're hungry, that you're tired, that your feet are aching because you're still wearing the same heels you put on at the beginning of the day. When it was over, she sat in silence for a long moment, looking at the stack of revised documents on the table. Then she said, without looking at me, "You're very good at what you do." It wasn't an effusive compliment. It was an observation, almost clinical. But coming from her, it was one of the closest things to a genuine thank you I had ever received. I said, "I'm just doing my job." And she looked at me then, that deep brown gaze that I had already learned to read in controlled doses. "No," she said, "you're doing more than that, and you know it." After that, she picked up her bag and left. I stood there for a moment in the silence of the empty office, those words echoing in a way that didn't match how simple they were. This channel is for stories that don't fit out loud. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, so you don't miss what comes next, because this story has a long way still to go. November arrived with that dry cold that New York imposes like a mandate. The weeks after the case crisis were different. Not radically, not in any way the rest of the office would have noticed. But I noticed. Small things. Claire started including me in meetings where my presence wasn't strictly necessary. She started giving me context before tasks, instead of just the task itself. Once, passing by my desk, she dropped an open legal journal to a specific page and said, "Read that article. It's relevant to the Harrison case," without breaking her stride. It wasn't intimacy. It was consideration. But for Claire Donovan, consideration was a foreign language being learned in public, and there was something almost moving about watching it happen. I wasn't falling in love. I needed to believe that. I was straight. I had been my whole life. I had only ever dated men, had only ever felt drawn to men, had a perfectly linear history that left no room for any other interpretation. My mother would sleep soundly with that history. My grandmother would pray with relief. My hometown in Tennessee would put a gold star of approval on my forehead. But there are things you feel before you have words for them. And what I felt when Claire walked into a room, when she said my name in that specific tone she used when she was focused and fully present, when our fingers almost touched in the exchange of documents, that wasn't professional admiration. I was already willing to admit that to myself, even if I didn't yet know what to do with it. The wine night was a Friday in November. It wasn't a crisis like before. It was a large project that needed to be finalized before the end of the day, because one of the partners had an immovable deadline, and Claire had decided to personally supervise the final stage. The team left the office in waves. By 7, 3 people remained. By 8:30, 2. By 9:15, when the last associate finally sent the completed document and walked out with visible relief, it was just the 2 of us. The office at night had a different quality. The light was warmer because only the desk lamps were on, not the overhead fluorescents. The noise of the city arrived muffled through the thick glass. There was a stillness that was impossible during the day. Claire sat at her desk for a long moment after the last file was closed. I was gathering my papers, preparing to reach for my coat and go, when she stood up, crossed to the cabinet in the corner of the room, and took out a bottle of red wine. I had never seen that cabinet open before. "Do you drink?" she asked. Not as a social offer. As a genuine question. "I do," I said. She retrieved 2 crystal glasses from the same cabinet, set everything on the oval conference table in the corner of the room, and made a vague gesture toward the chair across from hers. It wasn't quite an invitation, but it was nothing less than one either. I sat down. She opened the bottle with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times alone, poured both glasses, and stared at the wine for a moment before drinking. Pinot Noir, I would learn later. She liked wine with character, she said once. Things that didn't try to be what they weren't. We sat in silence for maybe 2 minutes. And it was good silence, not the tense quiet of the workplace. It was the silence of 2 people who were tired from the same day and didn't need to pretend they weren't. "Where are you from?" she asked. It was the first personal question she had ever asked me in almost a year of working closely together. "Nashville," I said. "Though I grew up somewhere smaller before that. You've probably never heard of it." "I tried to live in Nashville once," she said. "Lasted 4 months. It's not for everyone," I agreed. She almost smiled. Not a full smile. It was that barely perceptible movement at the corner of her mouth that I had learned to recognize as the equivalent of a full laugh in anyone else. The conversation unfolded in a way I can't quite describe without diminishing it. It was the kind of conversation that feels too natural to be real, where one thing leads to another without effort, where you don't feel time passing because you're too present to worry about the clock. She told me she had grown up in Boston. The daughter of a lawyer father and a pianist mother, a combination she described as structurally conflicted, that she had chosen law not because of her father's influence, but in spite of it, because she wanted to prove she could walk the same path without the shadow of his name, that she had arrived in New York at 24 with 1 suitcase and a productive anger that hadn't entirely gone away. I listened and drank and felt my chest do things I hadn't authorized. Have you ever felt something like that? That feeling of a conversation showing you a version of a person you already knew existed but had never been allowed to see, as if the world had been slightly more honest for exactly that stretch of time? Then she asked about the relationship. Not directly. She said, "You mentioned once that you've been living alone since last year, and I said yes, that I had ended a long relationship." And she said, looking at her glass, "Endings are harder when there's no clear person to blame." I was quiet for a moment. "How do you know there wasn't?" I asked. "Because you don't seem resentful," she said. "You seem relieved, and relieved is more complicated to explain." I didn't know what to say. She looked at me then, genuinely, not the quick evaluating glance of the work environment. It was a slower look, more present. "I was married," she said, as if she had decided to share that now. "For 6 years. To a good man. The marriage ended not from a lack of love, but from an excess of differences we pretended for too long were compatible." "Do you have children?" I asked. "No." A pause. It didn't get that far. There was something in that sentence she wasn't saying. I didn't ask, but I kept it. The second glass was quieter than the first. The kind of silence that happens when two people have moved past the stage of introduction and are simply existing in the same space without needing to fill it. And then she did it. It wasn't planned. I know that now, and I knew it then too. It was one of those moments that happen in the space between one decision and the next, when the body moves before the mind has finished deliberating. She had leaned slightly forward, her elbows on the table, her glass between her fingers, and she was looking at me with that expression I still didn't have a complete name for. And then she extended her free hand and touched my face. Just that. One hand. The tips of her fingers against my cheek. The lightest possible touch, less than 3 seconds, and the world stopped. Not dramatically, not with music or slow motion. It stopped the way the world stops when something real happens, when reality recalibrates in real time and you're left there trying to keep up. She was close. Close enough. And there was a question on her face that wasn't made of words. But then she pulled back, slowly. She picked up her glass. She looked to the side, and the moment left. Neither of us spoke. For maybe 40 seconds that felt like an hour. We sat in silence looking forward. Then she said, her voice completely controlled, "It's getting late." And I said, "It is." I got my coat. She walked me to the office door as though it were a professional courtesy. The elevator came. I stepped in. The doors closed. And I stood watching my own reflection in the brushed metal of those elevator doors for all 17 floors of the descent, with the feeling of her hand still against my face, trying to understand what had happened to the version of myself that had been so certain she knew who she was. Monday was an exercise in performance. I arrived at the usual time. Her espresso was in the right cup. The schedule was reviewed. I had rehearsed my face the entire weekend, in the bathroom mirror, in the reflection of the subway window, in the dark surface of my phone when the screen went black. A neutral expression, professional. The expression of someone who had spent Friday evening drinking wine with her boss and absolutely nothing of significance had happened after that. Claire arrived at 7:28, 2 minutes before her usual time. She walked in, extended her hand. I placed the cup. She moved on. Perfect choreography, but when she reached the door to her office, she stopped for a second. Her back to me, and said, without turning around, "Good morning, Maya." It was the first time in nearly a year that she had said good morning. She walked in and closed the door. I stood there with the tray in my hands for maybe 10 seconds. The weeks that followed were built of small things like that. A good morning here, a glance that lasted a second longer there. Once she came to my desk with a document, and instead of simply dropping it the way she always had, she waited for me to finish typing. And when I looked up, she was looking at me in a way that made my heart do something foolish in my chest. But nothing was said. Nothing was named. I started to understand that this was her language. Not words. Not large gestures. It was the language of gaps, of what lives between one thing and another, of what communicates itself precisely by not being spoken. And I, who had grown up in a family where things were clear enough to be dull, and where any ambiguity was resolved with a Bible verse or my mother's opinion, I was learning to speak that language in a way that frightened me with its naturalness. The problem was everything else. Everything else was my life outside that 17th floor. My mother called every Sunday. She asked if I had been out with anyone, if I had been to church, if I had considered calling Daniel. Not directly, of course. She was sophisticated in her suggestions. I ran into Daniel's mother at the grocery store. She said he's working in Chicago now. Sounds like he's doing really well, as if that information had been offered by accident. I listened. I said things are fine, Mom. I changed the subject. My best friend, Renata, who had left Brazil years before and was the most perceptive person I knew, started asking what was going on because, in her words, "You're different, and it's not the kind of different that happens when you get a haircut." I had light brown hair, straight, shoulder length. I had cut it at the beginning of fall. But Renata knew that wasn't it. "Did something happen at work?" she asked one afternoon when we were having coffee at her apartment. "No," I said. She looked at me in that way she had. "Something happened with someone at work," she corrected. It wasn't a question. I sat in silence for a moment too long to be a convincing denial. "Maya," her voice was gentle, "you don't have to tell me now, but you don't have to pretend there's nothing either." I left without telling her, but I carried that conversation with me for days. Have you ever held a truth in your throat that wasn't a lie but also wasn't ready to be spoken? It's a strange place to live. You're not exactly hiding. You're just waiting for the right words to exist. I didn't have the right words yet. At the office, December began to arrive with that particular energy that law firms have in December. A desperate rush to close cases before the recess. Corporate parties that everyone dreads but no one can skip. And a collective tension that made everyone slightly less human than usual. Claire got busier. I got busier. There were days when we only crossed paths in the exchange of documents and emails, without truly looking at each other, but there was one particular Friday. It was a team meeting I had to organize, and in the middle of everything, she needed a file that was on my computer. She came to my desk. Instead of asking me to email it, she stood behind me, slightly leaned in, looking at the screen while I opened the folders. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth of her. And then she said, pointing at the screen, "That one." And her hand passed over my shoulder to indicate the file, and she didn't touch me, but she was millimeters away, and I felt that through my entire body as though she had. She took what she needed and walked away. I sat looking at the screen for a long time without seeing anything. It was that night, in my apartment, lying on my back staring at the ceiling, that I finally stopped pretending. It wasn't a dramatic moment of revelation. There was no epiphany with a soundtrack. It was more like when you finally admit you're in pain after days of pretending you're not. A relief and a sadness at the same time. Because naming the pain doesn't resolve it. It only makes it real. I had feelings for Claire Donovan. It wasn't professional admiration. It wasn't friendship forming. It wasn't gratitude for the way she had begun treating me differently. It was attraction. It was that thing that makes you look for someone in a room before you look for anyone else. That makes you hold on to details that don't need to be held. That keeps you awake at night replaying conversations that should have been unremarkable. And I had absolutely no idea what to do with that. Because she was my boss. Because there were 12 years between us. Because she had been married to a man, and I had never let myself imagine anything beyond that. Because my mother would have a silent and devastating collapse if she knew. Because my hometown in Tennessee didn't even have vocabulary for this. Because I myself barely had vocabulary for this yet. And because above all, I didn't know if what had happened that night with the wine and the touch against my face was the beginning of something, or an aberration she had already decided to bury. Here on this channel, we tell the stories that don't fit out loud. If any part of what you're hearing is reaching something in you, leave a comment below. We don't have to be alone in the stories we can't say in a regular voice. The office Christmas party was on a Thursday in December. A rented venue, good drinks, quiet music. That particular atmosphere of people who see each other every day trying to pretend they know each other outside of a professional context. I went in a dark green dress that Renata had insisted I buy months earlier, and that I had never had an occasion to wear. Claire arrived 40 minutes after the party had started. I saw her walk in, and that thing happened that happens when you've stopped pretending. You can no longer control the first reaction. She was wearing a black blazer slightly different from her usual work ones, her hair pinned in a softer way than usual, and there was something in her expression that was less armored than it typically was. She saw me before I could look away. There was no way to pretend I hadn't seen her either. She walked toward me with that posture I knew by heart now, stopped at a polite distance and said, "That green suits you, just like that, no context." Without the professional framing she always put around anything personal, she said. I said thank you, and my heart did that foolish thing again. We stayed near each other through parts of the evening, not together in any obvious way, but close. There was the dynamic of two planets orbiting around the same point without touching. At some point in the night, we found ourselves at the edge of the room, away from the music and the noise, glasses in hand. "Are you going to Nashville for the holidays?" she asked. "My mother is expecting me," I said, in a tone that clearly communicated it was an obligation, as much as it was a desire. She almost laughed. "Family. Are you going to Boston?" I asked. "No," she said, simply, without elaborating. I looked at her and she looked at me, and there was that specific tension of two people who know what's in the air but neither knows how to land it. Then she said, very quietly, almost to herself, "This kind of thing gets complicated very quickly, Maya." I knew exactly what she was referring to, and I said just as quietly, "I know." And that was it. The conversation turned somewhere else. A partner appeared with a question, and the evening continued on its course. But I went home with that sentence still resonating. This kind of thing gets complicated very quickly. It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't an invitation either. It was something in between, in that foggy territory where the most real things in life insist on existing. I flew to Nashville for Christmas. 3 days in my mother's house, in the middle-class neighborhood she had built with such care, with the Christmas decorations that were the same ones she'd had since I was 6 years old, with the tree she decorated alone every year since my father had left when I was 15, with the smell of cinnamon cookies that was the safest smell I knew in the world. My mother watched me with eyes that knew more than I had said, and less than I was feeling. "You seem different," she said on the first night, while we were washing the dishes together after dinner. "I'm fine, Mom." "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you seemed different." She didn't press further. That was her version of gentleness. I lay in that bed I had slept in since childhood, looking up at a ceiling I knew every mark of, and I found myself thinking about Claire in an apartment in New York at Christmas. Alone, with a photograph face down in a drawer and a quietness she had built so carefully, she might not know anymore how to let anyone through it. I came back in January with a clarity I hadn't looked for, but that had arrived anyway. I wasn't going to pretend I didn't feel what I felt. But I also wasn't going to force anything. Some things need to find their own way, or they find no way at all. January was a month of rebuilding rhythm. The office came back slowly. Cases resumed. Claire's calendar filled up again. But there was a difference that only I could see. She had stopped holding herself back quite so much. It was nothing an outside observer would notice. It was the accumulation of tiny things. She started asking my opinion in situations where before she would only give orders. One Saturday morning she sent me a text outside of work hours, asking if I had read a specific article about a case we'd worked on together. And we ended up exchanging messages for 40 minutes about law and about absolutely nothing at the same time. When I arrived at the office on Monday, she was already at my desk before I got there. And when I walked in, she said, as though it were entirely natural, "You were right about the Harrison case approach. I'm using your perspective in the hearing." It was the first time she had ever attributed an idea to me in front of anyone. I stood there for a moment, coat still on, and said, "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said, and walked back to her office. That was Claire. Precision where other people would use warmth. And I had come to understand, over months of watching her, that for her precision was warmth. It was the highest form of respect she knew how to give. The evening it all changed was a Tuesday in late January. Not a crisis this time, not a project running late. It was something smaller. She called me into her office at 6:30, when most of the floor had already emptied, to review a document she was preparing for a presentation. It was a task that should have taken 30 minutes. It took 2 hours. Not because the document was difficult, because we kept talking. I don't remember exactly how it started. One comment on the document led to a question about strategy, which led to a conversation about the broader case, which led to her telling me something about why she had taken the case in the first place, which had to do with something she believed about the limits of corporate power, and that belief connected to something that had happened early in her career that she had never told anyone in that office. I could hear that in the way she said it. The particular cadence of a story being told for the first time, and then she stopped mid-sentence. I was sitting across the desk from her, leaning slightly forward, and she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen in full before. It had been there in pieces, in fragments I had caught and tried not to examine too closely. But that night it was whole. It was a look that said, "I trust you more than I meant to." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said, "You don't have to stop." She looked away, looked back. Something moved across her face. "You make it easy," she said quietly, "to talk. I'm not used to that. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it for a real moment before you move on. Have you ever been the person someone chose to be honest with, when honesty clearly didn't come easily to them? There's a specific responsibility in that, a specific weight, because you understand, in that moment, that you're holding something fragile, and you can feel how much it cost them to put it in your hands. That was what that evening felt like to me. She wasn't declaring anything. She wasn't crossing any line, but something was being given, carefully and without fanfare. And I was receiving it the same way. We finished the document at 9. She called for a car for me before I could say I'd take the subway. We rode down the elevator together, and in the lobby, before the car arrived, she stood beside me and didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and the city noise came in from outside like it always did, indifferent and constant. When the car pulled up, she said, "Good night, Maya," and I said, "Good night, Claire." First name. I had never used it before without her having told me to. She had never told me to. She noticed. I saw it. One breath of surprise, swiftly contained. But she didn't correct it. February in New York is a test of character. The city turns gray in a way that isn't romantic, isn't dramatic, is just cold and persistent and slightly exhausting. The holiday warmth is long gone. Spring is too far to be a comfort. You have to find your reasons to keep going somewhere inside yourself, because the city certainly isn't offering them. I was finding mine at work. That should have worried me more than it did. I knew, with a clarity that I couldn't explain away anymore, that what I felt for Claire had moved somewhere permanent. It wasn't infatuation, which burns fast and specific. It wasn't admiration, which you can contain and file and carry professionally. It was something that had grown roots in the months I had been paying attention to her, learning her, keeping her silences company without asking them to explain themselves. I had started going to therapy in January. Not directly because of Claire, or not only. It was Renata who had gently, persistently suggested it for months, and I had finally run out of reasons to refuse. My therapist was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Park, who had a small office in Midtown, and the particular skill of asking exactly the question you had been avoiding asking yourself. In our third session, she asked me to describe a relationship in my current life that felt significant. I talked about Claire for 45 minutes. Dr. Park didn't make a face. She didn't give a verdict. She asked, "What is it that you want from this person?" I thought about it for a long time. "I want her to know that she doesn't have to be so alone," I said finally. Dr. Park looked at me. "And is that about her? Or is it also about you?" I went home and sat with that question for 2 days. Meanwhile, the office continued. Cases moved forward. Claire was in the middle of a particularly complex litigation that was consuming most of her attention, and there were days when we barely exchanged more than the necessary words. But those words were different now. There was a texture to them that hadn't existed before, a recognition. One afternoon I brought her a document and set it on her desk and started to turn away, and she said, "Wait." I turned back. She was looking at the document, not at me. Then she said, "How are you doing?" Actually, not as a formality, as an actual question. I looked at her for a moment. "I'm okay. A little tired. You?" She finally looked up. "I've been better," she said, and the simplicity of that sentence, the lack of armor in it, hit me somewhere I didn't expect. The Henderson case? I asked. The Henderson case, she confirmed. But her eyes said it was also other things she wasn't naming. I sat down in the chair across from her desk without being invited to. I don't know what made me do it. Some line had been crossed in the previous months, gradually enough that I couldn't point to the exact moment it had happened. She raised an eyebrow, not disapprovingly. Tell me something that has nothing to do with work, I said. She looked at me. A long, considering look. Then she said, I've been thinking about getting a dog. I don't know why that cracked me open a little. Maybe because it was so unexpectedly ordinary. Maybe because a dog was the opposite of the solitude I had been imagining for her in that apartment on the nights I thought about her too much. Maybe because it meant she was thinking about softness, about needing something to come home to. What kind? I asked. Something that doesn't require a lot of convincing to be around me, she said. A pause. Then, that limits the options considerably. I laughed, genuinely. And she looked at me when I laughed with an expression so openly warm that it stopped my breath for a second. The moment lasted exactly as long as moments like that last before the world interrupts them. Her phone rang. She answered it. The conversation that followed was professional and took her fully back into the work version of herself. I left quietly, with the document receipt in hand, and walked back to my desk in a state of something I couldn't have put a clean name on. Write in the comments what this story is making you feel. I read every single one, and I need to know I'm not telling this into the void. It was a Friday afternoon in the middle of February when the thing happened that I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count. I was working late, not because Claire had asked me to, but because I had 3 things I wanted to finish before the weekend. The floor was quiet. Most people had gone. I was at my desk with headphones in one ear. Not music, just the quiet white noise of concentration. She appeared at my desk without warning. I looked up and she was standing there in her coat, ready to leave, keys in hand. You should go home, she said. I have a few things left, I said. She didn't move. I took out the earphone. Is there something you need? She looked at me for a moment with that expression that I had spent months learning to read and still couldn't fully decode. Then she said, Come get coffee with me. Not a work request. Plainly and simply not a work request. I looked at her. Now? I asked. If you can leave those things, she said. I could leave those things. We both knew I could leave those things. I got my coat. We went to a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the building that I had walked past 100 times and never entered. It was warm and slightly cramped, and had the kind of lighting that makes everyone look better than they are. We sat at a table for 2 near the window and ordered coffee, and outside the February city moved past indifferently. She talked more than I had ever heard her talk. Not about work. About Boston when she was young, about her mother playing piano on Sunday mornings and how that sound had become, without her choosing it, her internal definition of peace, about the marriage, more than she had shared before, about how it had ended not with a confrontation, but with a mutual understanding that arrived too late, when they were both already tired of pretending the shape of what they had built was still the right shape. She talked about loneliness in a way that wasn't self-pitying. It was almost clinical, the way she talked about it, as if she were diagnosing a condition she had learned to manage rather than cure. I'm good at being alone, she said. I've had a lot of practice. Being good at something doesn't mean it's what you want, I said. She looked at me across that small table with the winter light coming through the window, and something in her face that was as close to exposed as I'd ever seen her be. No, she said quietly. It doesn't. We sat with that for a moment. Then I said, Claire, I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. She set down her cup, waited, and I told her. Not everything. Not in the way you might imagine from a film or a novel. I didn't make declarations or confessions of overwhelming love. I told her simply that I had come to feel something for her that I hadn't expected and hadn't asked for, that I wasn't asking her to feel the same, that I wasn't asking for anything at all, but that I was tired of being in the same room as something real and pretending it was furniture. The silence that followed was the longest I had ever sat through. She didn't look away during any of it. When she spoke, her voice was careful in the way it was careful when something actually mattered to her. "I know." 2 words. "I know," she said again. "And I've been telling myself all the reasons why it can't be straightforward. All the reasons why this kind of thing becomes complicated. I've been telling myself that long enough that I've gotten very fluent in all of them." She paused. "But I stopped believing them somewhere around November," she said. My heart did something I had no category for. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, not the light touch on my cheek from that first night. A full, intentional, unmistakable thing. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not good at this. I haven't been good at this in a long time. And there are real complications between us that don't disappear because we name what they are. I know all of that," I said. "And you're still sitting here." "I'm still sitting here." She looked at our hands on the table, then at me, and for the first time since I had known her, the expression on her face was entirely uncalculated. No armor, no professional distance, no management of what she was allowing to show. Just her. She was 38 years old with dark eyes and a lifetime of practiced solitude, and a photograph face down in a drawer, and a warmth she had learned so thoroughly to contain that I sometimes wondered if she herself had forgotten it was there. I was 26 years old with light brown hair, and a family that wouldn't understand, and a life history that had no map for this particular road, and a heart that had decided, without consulting any of my careful logic, that she was worth every bit of the complication. We stayed in that coffee shop until they started putting chairs on tables. We walked back toward the office building in the February cold, and when we reached the corner where we would go separate ways to our separate subway lines, she stopped. She looked at me with that expression I now had a full name for. She said, "This isn't going to be easy," I said. "No. And you're not scared." It wasn't quite a question, but I answered it like one. "I'm terrified," I said honestly. "But not of this. Not of you." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away somewhere careful. Then she said, "Good night, Maya." And I said, "Good night, Claire." She turned and walked toward her subway entrance, and I stood on that corner in the February cold and watched her go, and the city moved all around me, indifferent and loud and enormous, and none of it mattered even a little. I want to tell you how it ends. I want to give you the version where it's simple. But I think you already know that it wasn't simple. You've been listening long enough to know that the things worth having rarely are. My mother found out 3 months later. Not from me, not directly, but from the particular intuition that mothers have when something has changed in you that they recognize without wanting to. She was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she said she needed time. I told her I understood. I didn't tell her that understanding didn't make it hurt less. There were conversations at the office, careful and professional ones, about what a shift in our dynamic would mean for both of us. Claire was rigorous about that. So was I. We changed the reporting structure. There were forms to file, and they were filed. It was handled with the same precision she brought to everything, and I loved her for it, even while finding the logistics slightly absurd. Renata cried, the good kind, when I finally told her everything in her kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, while her cat slept between us on the couch. "I knew," she said. "I knew since October. I just didn't know if you knew." "I knew," I said. "I just didn't know what to do with it. And now?" I thought about Claire that morning, in my kitchen, standing at the window with a coffee mug in both hands, looking at the street below with an expression that was the opposite of the one she wore in the office, quiet, present, not managing anything. "Now I know what to do with it," I said. "I told you at the beginning that this wasn't a beautiful love story, the kind with airport running and declarations in the rain. But I want to take that back, not because it became easy. It didn't. There are still moments when I see her in a meeting, fully armored and unreadable, and I find it almost funny that I am the only person in the room who knows what she sounds like when she laughs without preparing herself to. There are still Sunday phone calls with my mother that end a little sooner than they should. There are still questions I carry that don't have clean answers, but there is also this. A woman who learned to practice solitude like a discipline has started to let someone stay, and I have learned that the shape of who you are is not always the shape you were handed. Sometimes you grow into a different one. Not better, not worse, just more true. You asked, at the beginning, to come closer, to close what you had open. I hope you did. I hope this reached you in whatever city you're in tonight, in whatever room, in whatever version of yourself you are carrying right now. Because this story, the real one underneath the names and the offices and the wine and the winter nights, is about something simpler and harder than any of those details. It's about what happens when you stop pretending you don't feel what you feel. It's about the space between what is safe and what is real. It's about the particular courage of reaching toward something you have no map for. And it's about how sometimes, against all your careful logic, the most terrifying thing and the most right thing are exactly the same thing. Tell me in the comments what part of this stayed with you. Tell me what city you're in. Tell me if you've ever loved someone in the language of gaps and silences and small things that only you could see. I think you have, and I think you know exactly what I mean. This channel exists for the stories that don't fit out loud. If this one reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We keep the light on here for exactly that.